What if death wasn't the end? Not in a hopeful, poetic way, but in a mechanical, structural, and spiritual sense. What if ancient civilizations knew something we've forgotten? Not about how we die, but how the soul leaves the body. Because here's a secret that's been buried, sometimes literally, in tombs, chants, symbols, and sacred geometry. Across cultures, timelines, continents, and mythologies. Ancient death rituals weren't about grief. They were about navigation. They treated death not as a disappearance, but as a departure. And the rituals, they were exit protocols, specific codes and ceremonies designed to help the soul leave this density with awareness, clarity, and direction. The Egyptians called it the weighing of the heart. The Tibetans wrote the Bardo Thodol, a manual for navigating the after-death state. The Greeks passed through the river Styx. The Mayans mapped out Xibalba, the underworld with multiple gates. Even early Christians spoke of the light as a transitional space, not heaven, but a passage. But what connects all these? Why were so many cultures obsessed with preparing the soul for after the heartbeat stopped? Because they understood a truth modern society actively buries, that death is a transition, not just of place, but of consciousness, and how you leave determines where you arrive. See, most people assume the soul just floats away, but in these traditions, death is a process. The soul must detach from the physical shell, shed energetic residue, avoid spiritual traps, and align with the correct frequency to move into the next plane. And without guidance, without the correct vibration, intention, or awareness, the soul can get stuck, lost in the in-between, looped in reincarnation cycles, or pulled into realms not meant for its evolution. Ancient death rituals weren't superstition, they were technology, symbolic acts performed in physical space to trigger energetic memory, to awaken the soul in its most disoriented moment. They lit lamps not just for comfort, but to help guide the astral body. They sang chants to break the shock of death. They placed coins over eyes, not just for myth, but to signal transition. They purified the body to release attachment. These weren't random customs, they were precise tools, instructions, maps. The question is, why don't we use them anymore? So why don't we use them anymore? Because something shifted. At some point in history, the mystery of death was taken out of the hands of the mystic and handed to the institution. Religion replaced ritual with dogma. Science labeled consciousness as a brain function. And death, once a sacred threshold, became a sterile event. But ancient cultures knew better. They didn't need EEG machines to recognize when the soul left the body. They felt it, they tracked it, they worked to escort it. In Tibetan culture, monks would sit with the dying for hours or even days after the last breath, chanting specific mantras to guide the soul through the bardo, the liminal space between death and rebirth. They believed that confusion in this stage could cause the soul to cling to the physical world or spiral into lower realms. The Egyptians wrote literal manuals for the dead, not metaphorical stories, but spiritual survival guides. They believed the soul had to pass through gates, answer cosmic riddles, and stand before beings who measured the purity of the heart. These weren't fantasies, they were roadmaps, metaphysical GPS for the most important journey of all. And the reason for these rituals? Because the moment of death is disorienting. The soul, suddenly unanchored, may not even realize the body is gone. It might linger, wander, attach. That's why so many ancient traditions focus not just on death, but on awareness at the time of death. Because awareness is currency. It determines whether the soul can move forward or gets recycled. Let that land. The greatest danger wasn't dying, it was dying unconsciously, because unconsciousness at the moment of death left the soul vulnerable, open to interference, to manipulation, even to reincarnation under false terms. Yes, reincarnation wasn't always seen as a gift. To some ancient mystics, it was a trap, a recycling system that pulled the unaware back into the matrix of physical density before they could exit the cycle. That's why rituals mattered. They were not religious formalities. They were codes designed to wake the soul up as it left the body. Now imagine this. What happens when a civilization forgets all of this? What happens when people die in confusion, distraction, sedation? What happens when the soul is ripped from the body in fear? No guidance, no map, no remembrance. It doesn't ascend, it wanders. And we wonder why so many feel haunted, disconnected, lost. The answer isn't in superstition, it's in memory. Something ancient was forgotten, and the soul is still waiting for us to remember. To remember the ancient soul codes, we have to first unlearn modern death. We've been trained to treat it as a glitch, a medical failure, an endpoint. We've built a culture where death is hidden behind hospital curtains, sanitized, whispered about like a curse. But for thousands of years, the moment of death was seen as the most sacred moment of life. It was the portal, the crossing, the test, not a test of morality, but of awareness. Could the soul stay lucid? Could it recognize itself as separate from form? Could it resist the pull of regret, fear, and attachment long enough to ascend? That was the real challenge, and that's why ancient death rituals focused not just on the dead, but on the dying, because the vibrational state of the soul at the time of death was everything. Frequencies like love, peace, clarity, and forgiveness created a clean departure, an exit free of distortion, while fear, shame, bitterness, and confusion, those were anchors. They dragged the soul downward, back into the loop. The ritual tools were precise, chanting mantras to create a vibrational ladder, cleansing the body to sever energetic ties, lighting specific herbs or incense to stabilize the frequency of the room, speaking final truths aloud to clear karma. These weren't just symbols, they were functional technologies. They worked because the soul responds to frequency, not language. But today, how do we die? Hooked to machines, flooded with sedatives, drowned in noise and synthetic light, surrounded not by intention, but distraction. And the soul, it leaves confused, unaware, unprepared. If this is stirring something in you, don't push it away. Maybe it's not fear. Maybe it's memory. Maybe some part of you remembers the old ways, the rituals, the codes, the map. And if you do, then you're not just here to learn. You're here to become a keeper of the exit. Ancient rituals didn't just honor the soul. They protected it from lower planes, from false lights, from entities drawn to confusion. Because in many traditions, the post-death landscape is populated. Not all who appear are allies. Some are echoes, some are tricksters, some are farmers, harvesting unaware energy. And that's why awareness is not a luxury, it's a weapon. In a realm where form dissolves and frequency decides everything, the only protection is lucidity. To know yourself without a body, to feel your vibration through the fog, to recognize the traps by their pull, and choose higher. Let's go further, because if ancient cultures spent so much effort preparing for the soul's exit, then what exactly were they trying to avoid? To understand that, we need to step into the territory most fear to even imagine, the non-physical zones between lives. In the Tibetan tradition, it's called the bardo, a liminal, dreamlike space, one where the soul is confronted by visions, some terrifying, some beautiful, but all of them, according to the teachings, are projections of the soul's own mind. Let that sink in. The moment after death doesn't reveal reality, it reveals you. Whatever remains unprocessed, denied, or feared shows up as external entities or landscapes. And if the soul doesn't recognize this, if it reacts in terror or attachment, it gets pulled into another incarnation, another loop, another amnesia. But if the soul remains lucid, it can pass through the illusions and move on. This is the core teaching across many ancient systems. Clarity of consciousness is the only true freedom after death. Now, look around today. What are most people taught to fear? Death, Stillness, the unknown, the silence within. Why? Because a soul trained to fear death is easy to confuse after it. A soul addicted to stimulation, distraction, and ego identity is less likely to remain conscious when its body falls away. This is the danger, and ancient rituals were designed to reverse it. They didn't treat death as an emergency, they treated it as an initiation, a return, a moment where all the spiritual work of a lifetime was put to the test. That's why spiritual training was preparation for death, not because of morbid obsession, but because the final moments define the next trajectory. And here's something that might shock you. In some traditions, it was believed that certain lights appearing after death were false, mimics, designed to pull the soul back into density. The goal wasn't to follow the light blindly, but to know which light was yours. To move not toward the brightest glow, but the truest resonance. This wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. The soul doesn't rise by accident, it rises by recognition. And that's why the most powerful death rituals weren't loud or dramatic. They were subtle, precise, designed to bring the soul into such stillness that nothing could hook it again. Because the ultimate trap isn't darkness, it's forgetting what you are. Forgetting where you came from, forgetting that this was always just one layer of a much larger journey. And if you remember that, even at the threshold, then you don't die, you graduate. So how do we prepare now, in a world that is forgotten? Because let's be honest, most of us won't have monks at our bedside. We won't be wrapped in sacred cloth with incense burning and chants vibrating through the walls. We'll likely die in silence, in a hospital, in a home, in a system that sees death as an error to be corrected rather than a moment to be honored. But that doesn't mean the ritual is lost. It just means the ritual must move inward. You don't need a temple. Your body is already one. You don't need a priest. Your awareness is already sacred. The new ritual is inner preparation. It's what you carry with you in your field, and it starts now, long before the last breath. Every time you choose truth over performance, every time you confront a buried fear instead of bypassing it, every time you meditate, fast, breathe, walk away from chaos, or sit in silence, you're tuning your field. You're refining your frequency. You're rehearsing your own soul's exit. Because death isn't a stranger, it's your final teacher, and your soul will either graduate in that moment or repeat the class. So ask yourself, are you preparing? Not in fear, but in clarity. Do you know what emotional patterns still bind you to this plane? Do you know what beliefs might keep you looking back instead of forward when the body dissolves? Do you know how to stay conscious when everything you've ever identified with slips away? Because that is the final initiation, and ancient cultures didn't leave it to chance. Neither should we. Here's how you begin. Build a relationship with silence. Get comfortable with stillness. Practice letting go of attachments one by one. Make peace with your shadows. They won't disappear just because your body does. Learn to feel your own energy field so it's not foreign when it's all you have left. And above all, stop treating death like an interruption. Start seeing it as integration. The moment when every frequency you've cultivated becomes your compass. Not a punishment, not a reward, but a mirror. And in that mirror, you either recognize yourself or you don't. This is not about death, it's about what remains when everything else falls away. The body, the name, the memory, the story. What's left? Only the frequency you cultivated, only the truth you chose to live by or avoided until the end. Only the depth of awareness you carried when the lights dimmed and the silence deepened. Ancient death rituals weren't designed to save the soul, they were designed to remind it of what it is. Remind it where it came from. Remind it how to return without forgetting itself in the fog of transition. And this is the knowledge that was buried, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was dangerous. A soul that knows how to exit the cycle cannot be controlled, it cannot be rerouted, it cannot be recycled. That's why you were never taught this. That's why death became something to fear, to medicate, to avoid thinking about until the final second. Because a conscious death is the greatest threat to a system built on unconscious life. But now the memory is waking back up, in dreams, in whispers, in the pull you feel toward videos like this. the ones that make your skin tingle and your breath slow down. This isn't entertainment, it's activation. You came here to remember, to gather the tools your ancestors buried in symbols, stories, and rituals, to reclaim your soul's map, not from a book, from within. Because the exit strategy isn't something you learn, it's something you remember in the final moment, if you've cleared enough noise to hear it. And if you've made it this far, you're not just curious, you're ready. Ready to walk through this life knowing it's not the end. Ready to release fear and rehearse awareness. Ready to become the guide your own soul will need when the time comes. So when that moment arrives, and it will, you won't panic, you won't cling, you won't beg to stay. You'll recognize the shift, you'll feel the opening, and you'll choose, not just where to go, but what to become, because the soul never truly dies. It just waits for you to remember how to exit free.